a 107-qubit superconducting processor called Zuchongzhi 3.2 just reported cutting a specific class of qubit failure by roughly 72-fold, according to the group's own preprint, not yet peer-reviewed and not yet independently reproduced. The failure it targeted is not the one most error correction benchmarks even measure. That gap between what the standard metrics capture and what this result claims to suppress is where the entire race currently turns. Two bets now sit on the table. Bet A holds that suppressing leakage at the physical layer is the unlocking move that makes every subsequent error correction step cleaner, because leakage is uniquely toxic in a way ordinary errors are not. Bet B holds that one suppression figure on one chip is a single line in a much longer error budget, and that a large number in one channel can coexist with an overall logical error rate that hasn't moved enough to matter. What follows prices those two bets against the evidence, names the metric on which the favored bet plainly trails, and identifies the specific results that would move the line from here. To understand why leakage earns its own category, consider how error correction is built. Standard surface code correction is designed around bit flip errors and phase flip errors. The correction machinery reads syndrome measurements that assume each qubit occupies one of exactly two states, and it is very good at catching smudged or misread versions of those two states. But if a qubit slips into an unwanted third energy level, the machine doesn't flag it as a leakage event. It tries to interpret the resulting syndrome as a complex Pauli error and triggers a chain of incorrect correction decisions as a result. The leaked qubit doesn't just fail quietly, it feeds bad information into the correction stack and can drag its neighbors into false correction cycles. Think of it this way. Error correction is like a ballot counting machine built to handle exactly two kinds of ballots. It is very good at catching smudged yes votes and misread no votes. But if a third kind of ballot, one written in a language the machine doesn't recognize, gets into the stack, the machine doesn't flag it as uncountable. It tries to read it as a yes or a no, and the misread propagates through the count. A leaked qubit is that third ballot. The correction machinery was designed for two states, and a qubit that has drifted into a third doesn't trip the error detector cleanly. It trips it wrong. The timescale matters here. In many superconducting designs, the window in which a qubit can leak into an unwanted third level is comparable to the duration of the gate operations themselves. Leakage is not a slow background contamination. It competes with the computation in real time. Now lay the first weighing, is leakage actually qualitatively different from other error channels, or is it just another item on the budget? The Bet A case rests on a structural argument. Because leakage exits the two-state frame entirely, it generates syndrome patterns that standard decoders misread as Pauli errors. This means leakage can produce correlated logical failures with an outsized effect on the logical error rate relative to how often it occurs. The Bet B counter is that several leading superconducting teams have already developed leakage removal units precisely because the problem was known. And the relevant question is not whether leakage is bad, but whether 107 physical qubits with suppressed leakage outperform 107 physical qubits running leakage removal units on top of an unaddressed physical mechanism. The evidence at hand is the Zuchongzhi 3.2 preprint, which is the group's own claim. Published literature from multiple superconducting teams separately confirms that leakage is a documented concern for surface code implementations. What the literature does not yet contain is an independent measurement of Zuchongzhi 3.2 "S" leakage rates. The odds move modestly toward Bet A on the structural argument. Leakage's ability to corrupt syndrome data is genuinely different from Pauli errors and is not fully neutralized by leakage removal units running on top of a physical mechanism the design never addressed. But modestly is the right word. The structural argument was known before this result. What matters is whether the 72-fold number survives independent scrutiny. Now the clean loss? Priced flat. Even taking the 72-fold leakage suppression figure at full face value, Zuchongzhi 3.2 has not demonstrated logical qubits. The result is a physical qubit measurement. Google's Willow processor has published peer-reviewed results demonstrating error rates that decrease as the code distance increases, which is the below-threshold behavior that is the canonical proof of concept for practical error correction. On the metric that actually prices a path to useful quantum computation, logical error rate at scale, the Zuchongzhi 3.2 result does not yet compete with that peer-reviewed benchmark. The line moves toward the skeptical bet on this specific metric. Leakage suppression at the physical layer is upstream of logical qubit performance, and upstream progress does not reprice the downstream bet until it shows up in logical benchmarks. This concession stands on its own. And bet A holds a real advantage in one physical layer channel and a real deficit in the logical layer evidence that matters most. The second weighing addresses the baseline. A suppression ratio is only as meaningful as the number it divides. If the team's previous leakage rates were unusually high, either because earlier generations of the processor did not prioritize leakage control, or because the qubit design carries inherent leakage susceptibility, then a 72-fold improvement could reflect catching up to a level others already hold rather than pulling ahead of the field. The ratio does not tell you the absolute leakage rate after suppression. An absolute rate is what the error budget actually requires. The bet A response is that the absolute post-suppression rate is reported in the preprint and described as competitive with published figures from superconducting peers. But that comparison relies on the group's own characterization of competitor results, not a controlled side-by-side measurement under identical conditions. The odds move slightly toward the skeptical bet here. The 72-fold headline is the figure most likely to survive scrutiny in its order of magnitude, but whether it represents a genuine lead over peers or a convergence toward a standard they already hold is a question the current evidence cannot close. The third weighing concerns the constraint that shaped this result. The Chinese team has reported difficulty accessing certain leading-edge fabrication processes and high-end control electronics available to leading Western superconducting efforts. Faced with those constraints, the reported approach relies heavily on control pulse engineering and real-time leakage detection sequences rather than geometric suppression built into the qubit structure itself. This is a software-first and control hardware-first approach that does not depend on leading-edge fabrication access. The logic of a constraint becoming a catalyst applies with unusual precision to leakage suppression specifically, because geometric approaches to suppressing leakage can require process nodes and materials that the constrained path cannot easily reach. The rebuttal is that control pulse and detection sequence approaches to leakage suppression are not exclusive to the constrained path. Leading Western superconducting teams also use them, and some have published comparable physical leakage rates using similar techniques. The constraint shaped the emphasis, but it did not produce an approach that belongs only to the player who faced the constraint. Reports suggest the Zuchongzhi 3.2 approach is heavily weighted toward control and detection, which is consistent with the constraint thesis. But direct comparisons of absolute leakage rates across teams using control-only suppression versus geometric plus control approaches are not yet in the literature in a form that settles this. The constraint became catalyst thesis prices at moderate confidence for this specific result. The emphasis on physical layer control is consistent with the constraint, and the 72-fold figure, if it holds, would represent a genuine forcing function toward a technique the field underweighted. The thesis does not earn full credit until independent reproduction confirms the absolute rates. Now the decisive weighing. If the 72-fold leakage suppression figure survives independent reproduction, and the absolute post-suppression rate is confirmed to be competitive with peers, the significance is structural rather than incremental. Leakage is not captured in the standard gate fidelity and readout error metrics that dominate published benchmarks. A team that has driven down a failure mode the headline metrics don't measure has potentially built a cleaner physical substrate than the published comparisons suggest. The compounding consequence is real. Leakage suppression, if genuine, doesn't just improve one metric in isolation. It potentially lowers the physical error rate that error correction sees on every cycle, which means fewer physical qubits needed per logical qubit, which is the constraint that governs when useful computation becomes feasible. 3 points hold the line from moving all the way. First, the 72-fold figure is a vendor-reported claim from a preprint. The history of quantum computing benchmarking includes multiple cases where impressive single-metric figures did not survive full independent scrutiny under controlled conditions. Until an independent team measures Zuchongzhi 3.2 S leakage rates and confirms the absolute post-suppression value, the ceiling stays. Second, physical qubits with suppressed leakage are still physical qubits. The path from physical layer cleanliness to logical qubit performance runs through error correction overhead, decoder performance, syndrome extraction fidelity, and the full 2-qubit gate error budget. A chip that has solved leakage but still carries meaningful 2-qubit gate errors may not outperform a chip that carries moderate leakage but has lower overall physical error rates across all channels. Third, scaling is the unpriced variable. Real-time leakage detection sequences consume classical control bandwidth and add latency to the correction cycle. Whether those costs stay manageable at the qubit counts, where logical computation becomes practically useful, is an open engineering question this result does not address. Taken together, those 3 points synthesize to this. The evidence favors bet A conditionally. The structural argument is sound. The 72-fold figure is large enough that even a significant haircut would leave a meaningful result, and the constraint became catalyst logic earns its pay here. But the conditional is load-bearing. This is a preprint result, a single chip, a single channel, and the logical qubit evidence that would close the argument isn't in the result. The forward pricing passage is where the remaining uncertainty resolves. The first catalyst is independent reproduction of the leakage suppression figure by a team outside the group, or by a third-party benchmarking effort measuring Zuchongzhi 3.2 quote S absolute leakage rate under controlled conditions and comparing it against published figures from Google Willow and the current generation of chips from the other leading Western effort. If that reproduction confirms the absolute post-suppression rate, the 72-fold figure converts from a vendor claim to a benchmark, and every published logical qubit roadmap built on error budgets that didn't assign serious weight to leakage as a dominant channel faces a repricing. If the reproduction fails or significantly revises the figure downward, the line returns toward bet B, and the field treats leakage as an acknowledged problem without a demonstrated solution at this scale. The second catalyst is a logical qubit demonstration from the Zuchongzhi line itself, specifically a published result showing below threshold logical error rate scaling as code distance increases on a chip that carries the leakage suppression reported here. That result would be the single largest possible move toward bet A, because it would close the gap between the physical layer claim and the logical layer performance that actually prices the long-term race. It would also force a direct comparison with a peer-reviewed, below-threshold demonstration that already exists in the literature, a comparison the field has not yet had to make in a setting where leakage suppression was a controlled variable. Every quarter that passes without that logical qubit result moves the odds modestly toward bet B, because the absence is consistent with the skeptical reading that other error channels dominate the budget even after leakage is addressed. The third catalyst is publication of the full error budget from Zuchongzhi 3.2, covering 2 qubit gate fidelity, readout fidelity, and crosstalk characterization across the full 107 qubit chip, not just the leakage channel. Single channel figures are the standard format in quantum hardware press releases. Full error budgets are what the field uses to actually compare systems. If the full budget shows that leakage suppression was achieved without degrading other error channels, the line moves meaningfully toward bet A. If the full budget reveals that leakage was improved at the cost of elevated 2-qubit gate error or increased crosstalk, the line moves toward bet B and the 72-fold figure prices as a channel-level trade rather than a system-level advance. The absence of a published full budget is currently the most defensible reason to hold the line from moving further toward bet A. A fourth catalyst worth pricing is a direct response from the leading Western superconducting teams, either published leakage rate characterizations on their current chips or new results specifically addressing leakage suppression. If those teams publish competitive figures, the 72-fold ratio gets contextualized as a convergence rather than a lead, and the odds stay closer to the current balanced position. If neither team responds with comparable data, that silence is itself information, suggesting either that leakage has not been prioritized or that their current figures are not favorable for direct comparison. The analyst's read is this: the evidence favors bet A at moderate confidence with a hard ceiling. The structural argument for leakage's unique toxicity is not in dispute. The 72-fold figure, even if it takes a meaningful haircut in independent review, is large enough to represent a real advance in a channel of the standard benchmark's underweight. The constraint became catalyst logic applies with real precision here. The control and detection approach to leakage suppression is exactly the kind of emphasis a team develops when geometric solutions require fabrication access it doesn't have. And if the result holds, the constraint is part of the explanation for why the field was underweighting this channel. The restriction that was supposed to slow this effort down pushed the engineering emphasis toward physical layer control in a direction the broader field had not treated as the priority bet. That is the kind of irony that only resolves clearly in hindsight, and it only resolves at all if the number survives. Zuchongzhi 3.2 is still a 107-qubit chip running physical qubits as reported by the group. The 72-fold leakage suppression figure is still a vendor claim awaiting independent confirmation. Those two facts bracket every bet on this result. It is real enough to take seriously and uncertain enough that the odds stay in a range rather than collapsing to a conclusion. The line moved on a preprint. When the independent measurements arrive, it moves again, and whichever direction it moves will tell you more about who reaches reliable logical qubits first than almost anything else on the near-term calendar. Which bet would you back right now? That the 72-fold leakage suppression holds up under independent scrutiny and changes the physical layer landscape, or that the full error budget tells a more complicated story and the logical qubit gap stays where it is? Put your reasoning in the comments, and if you want to be here when the independent reproduction lands and the line moves again, subscribe. This channel prices the result, not the press release.